Anyone can say their case is an emergency. You need to complete the paperwork first. The front desk clerk pushed the intake form back toward the black single father, cradling his 8-year-old son at midnight. Noah's lips were already turning blue, but his file got shoved to the bottom of the queue over an unverified insurance card. Minutes later, a doctor cleared a private room for a donor's son with nothing more than a sore wrist. "Thank you, doctor." When Noah collapsed to the floor, security was called to remove the father instead. Then the entire hospital board came rushing down and called him sir. Whose son had they just refused to save? Before we find out, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because stories like Noah's only get more powerful with people like you watching until the very end. The rain had barely started when Terrence Coleman pulled his son's inhaler from the glove compartment for the third time that night. His hand shook as he tried to keep the old SUV steady on the road. Noah was folded against the passenger seat, his small chest rising and falling far too quickly. Every breath sounded like something he had to fight for. 3 years had passed since Rachel died. 3 years since the house had gone quiet in a way it never used to. During those years, Terrence had learned every sound his son's lungs could make. He knew what a normal cough sounded like. He knew what a bad attack sounded like. This was different. This frightened him. He had spent those 3 years trying to be enough for 2 parents at once. He went to school plays, doctor's appointments, bedtime stories, parent meetings, and every other moment Noah might have needed him. He never wanted his son to believe that losing his mother meant losing the stability of his family too. Noah was a curious, gentle 8-year-old who loved building cardboard rockets and asking questions his father couldn't always answer. His asthma had been part of their lives since he was a toddler. Terrence had learned to manage it the way people learn to manage a familiar danger. There was a spare inhaler in almost every jacket he owned, and he knew every urgent care center within 20 minutes of home. But tonight, nothing was working. They had just left the community center where Terrence spent 2 evenings every week mentoring children who reminded him of himself at that age. Children who needed someone steady more than they needed someone impressive. Noah had been laughing at something on his father's phone less than an hour earlier. Now he couldn't finish a sentence without gasping for the next breath. Terrence pulled the SUV towards St. Gabriel Medical Center. 6 minutes later, he was carrying Noah through the emergency entrance. He didn't wait for a wheelchair. He didn't want to lose even a few seconds. The sliding doors opened. At the front desk sat Vanessa Cole. She looked up at the soaked man holding a struggling child as though he were an inconvenience arriving at the wrong time. What Vanessa didn't know was that the man standing in front of her had personally helped fund the pediatric emergency unit inside the hospital. Terrence had built a foundation that supported pediatric emergency programs across 3 states. He also sat 1 seat away from the chair of St. Gabriel's board. But he had deliberately kept his identity separate from the hospital wing his foundation funded. He had made that decision years earlier because he never wanted nurses, doctors, clerks, or administrators to treat a family differently simply because they knew who was watching. Tonight, nobody knew who he was. And Noah didn't need them to know. He only needed them to look at him. Terrence's belief came from his father. His father had worked maintenance in a public hospital for 26 years, replacing light bulbs, repairing beds, and fixing whatever was broken while patients walked past him without knowing his name. One evening, Terrence had watched a wealthy family receive a private room while an elderly man waited for hours on a bench. His father looked at him and said something Terrence never forgot. The real measure of a hospital isn't how it treats people with money. It's how it treats the people who walk through the doors with nothing but hope. Terrence carried those words into adulthood. They influenced the foundation he built. They influenced the patient care charter he helped write for St. Gabriel. And they influenced the decision to keep his identity hidden. But tonight, his son was paying the price for a system that seemed to notice everything except the person in front of it. Vanessa asked for insurance information. Terrence stared at her. My son can't breathe. The insurance card first, she replied. It's on my phone, please. His inhaler isn't working. Vanessa pushed the intake form toward him. Everyone who comes through those doors believes their situation is an emergency. You need to complete the paperwork. Terrence looked down at Noah. His lips were beginning to turn gray. Please look at him. Vanessa typed something into the system. The note she entered described mild shortness of breath in an alert patient. It didn't mention the failed inhaler. It didn't mention the changing color of Noah's lips. It didn't mention how difficult every breath had become. That single inaccurate entry pushed Noah toward the bottom of a waiting list Terrence couldn't see. Then the emergency doors opened again. Charles Whitmore walked in with his teenage son. The boy was holding his wrist after injuring it during sports practice. Vanessa recognized the Whitmore name. Her entire posture changed. She immediately called for the charge nurse, Helen Price. A private room is available, she announced. The room had apparently been available all along. Noah had arrived first. Noah was struggling to breathe. Charles's son had a sprained wrist. Yet the Whitmore family was taken straight back. Charles noticed the situation. He looked toward Noah and said, "Shouldn't that child be seen first?" Helen smiled politely. Everything is being handled according to procedure. Charles didn't look convinced. He glanced back at Terrence before following his son. Terrence watched silently. He understood something important. This wasn't about a lack of space. It wasn't about a crowded emergency room. There had been an empty room. It simply hadn't been offered to Noah. The difference seemed to be the name attached to the family. Dr. Ethan Brooks was the physician on duty. He looked at Vanessa's note and never walked over to examine Noah. Terrence approached him. My son can't breathe. Brooks glanced at the chart. It says mild breathing difficulty. Look at him. I have patients with genuine emergencies waiting. Terrence pointed toward Noah. He's right there. Brooks's expression hardened. Raising your voice isn't going to move you up the list. I'm not asking to move up a list. I'm asking you to examine my child. Brooks reminded him that St. Gabriel was a private hospital and that people couldn't simply demand treatment on their own terms. The words weren't openly insulting, but the message underneath them was clear. Some people were treated as though their voices mattered more than others. Across the room, a young nurse named Olivia Reed had been watching. She noticed what Brooks didn't. Noah's chest wasn't simply rising quickly. It was collapsing inward with every breath. She walked toward him and slipped a pulse oximeter onto his finger. The number appeared. Olivia's expression changed immediately. She brought oxygen. This child needs to be evaluated now. Brooks looked irritated. You've worked here 6 months, Olivia. Return to your station. The reading is dangerously low. It could be inaccurate. Olivia didn't argue. She placed the oxygen mask where Terrence could reach it. Keep this on him. It was a small act, but it was the first thing anyone had done that actually helped Noah. Terrence had spent nearly an hour trying every reasonable route. He asked for another assessment. He asked for a doctor. He asked for the head of emergency services. He asked about pediatrics. He asked for patient safety. Every request was redirected. Finally, Helen told him to return to the waiting chairs. Terence refused. I will not carry my son back to the end of a line when he can't breathe. Helen called security. 2 guards approached. Terence didn't shout. He didn't threaten anyone. He simply held his son and refused to move. One guard quietly asked whether Terence could wait somewhere else while the situation was sorted out. Terence looked at him. Are you asking me to move a child who can't breathe because it's more convenient? The guard had no answer. Behind the desk, Vanessa continued looking at her monitor. The inaccurate note had become more than a mistake. It had become the hospital's excuse. Helen relied on it. Brooks relied on it. Everyone was protecting the decision that had already been made instead of correcting it. Vanessa didn't want to admit she had entered the wrong information. Helen didn't want to admit she had trusted an inaccurate intake note. Brooks didn't want to admit he had relied on a chart without examining the patient. And security had been called to protect the order of the waiting room instead of protecting the child inside it. Noah was disappearing beneath the paperwork. Terence could see it happening. Across the room, the Whitmore family received water and blankets. A patient relations employee even asked whether they needed transportation home. 40 feet away, Terence sat on a hard plastic chair with an oxygen mask pressed against his son's face. Nobody offered him anything. No blanket. No water. No explanation. No help. He watched Noah's chest. He counted each breath. Then he heard Helen quietly tell Vanessa that they couldn't keep the Whitmores waiting. Terence turned toward her. Does my son have to wait because his name isn't on a plaque? Nobody answered. Charles Whitmore heard the question. He stepped out of the private room. Please, Charles said. See the boy first. Brooks dismissed him. Return to your son, Mr. Whitmore. We're handling it. Charles looked uncomfortable. He knew he was benefiting from a system that was failing someone else. But he hesitated. Then he returned to his son. Terence didn't blame him. The problem wasn't Charles. The problem was the system that had responded to his name before responding to Noah's condition. Then Noah's breathing changed. It became quieter. Terence knew immediately that quiet wasn't necessarily good. A child fighting for air makes noise. A child running out of strength can become silent. Brooks glanced over. He seems calmer now. Olivia knew better. She approached him again. Doctor, he's getting worse. Brooks turned sharply. I told you to return to your station. You need to look at him. You've been here 6 months. I know what I'm seeing. Brooks warned her that if she continued overriding his judgment, he would file a formal complaint. Olivia stepped back. Not because she agreed. Because she knew arguing further might prevent her from helping Noah at all. Terence watched her. He realized the hospital's problem went deeper than one doctor's bias. The culture punished people who spoke up. Silence was safer than courage. And Noah was paying for that silence. Other patients had begun filming. A mother whispered that Noah had arrived before the Whitmores. An older man asked why the child struggling to breathe hadn't been taken back. Helen noticed the phones. Stop recording, she ordered security. She claimed Terence was causing unnecessary panic. But the room was already watching. The hospital couldn't hide what was happening anymore. Then Noah looked around. He saw the private rooms. He saw his father's wet jacket. He saw the people who kept walking past him. And in a voice barely louder than a whisper, he asked, Dad, are they making me wait because we don't look rich? Terrence felt something break inside him. He could endure insults. He could endure being ignored. He could endure people judging his clothes. But he could not let his son believe his life was worth less because of what his father wore. Terrence knelt in front of him. He looked directly into Noah's tired eyes. You don't have to be rich. He paused. You don't have to be famous. You don't have to know anybody in this building. You deserve to be helped because you're a human being. That's enough. Noah's fingers tightened around his father's sleeve. Terrence kept his voice steady. This isn't your fault. Noah nodded weakly. Olivia heard every word. And something inside her changed. She walked to a hospital terminal. Without asking permission, she entered Noah's actual oxygen reading into the system. The number triggered a pediatric emergency alert. The alert appeared on Brooks's terminal. It also entered the hospital's permanent internal log. There was now a record. No one could quietly erase it. Brooks saw the alert. His first reaction wasn't concern. It was anger. He accused Olivia of bypassing protocol. Then he turned toward Terrence. If you're unhappy with the care here, you can take your son to a public hospital. Terrence looked at him. My son doesn't need a different hospital. He pointed toward the room. He needs the people already inside this hospital to do their jobs. Security stepped closer. One guard said, Sir, please calm down. Terrence remained calm. Are you prepared to write in your report that you removed a child struggling to breathe before a doctor examined him? The guards looked at each other. Helen ordered them to continue. Then Noah tried to stand. His legs gave out. He collapsed. The oxygen mask slipped from his face. Terrence lunged forward. For one terrible second, the entire emergency department became silent. Then Olivia moved. She dropped to her knees. Emergency code. Now. Her voice carried across the room. Everyone moved. Even the guards froze. Brooks finally crossed the room. He looked at the monitor. Then at Noah. Then at the chart. Terrence caught his arm. How many times did you actually look at my son before deciding he wasn't worth examining? Brooks opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Terrence stepped away. Help him. For the first time that night, Brooks did exactly that. Terrence reached for his phone. He made one call. Eleanor Hayes answered. She was the chair of St. Gabriel's board. Terrence's voice remained calm. I'm downstairs with Noah. He collapsed after being left untreated. He wasn't properly evaluated. Eleanor went silent. Bring the board downstairs, Terrence continued, and preserve every record from tonight. She understood immediately. 12 floors above the emergency department, Eleanor had been preparing for the next day's ribbon-cutting ceremony. The new pediatric emergency wing was supposed to represent everything St. Gabriel stood for. Terrence had helped fund it. He had helped write the patient care charter. And now his son was lying on the floor beneath the very building that was supposed to protect children like him. Eleanor ended the meeting. The hospital chief executive, medical director, general counsel, and several board members followed her toward the elevator. They didn't ask many questions. They simply moved. The elevator reached the emergency floor less than a minute later. The doors opened. Eleanor stepped out. Then she saw Noah. The child was on the floor with an oxygen mask against his face. Olivia was kneeling beside him. Terrence was holding his shoulder. Two security guards stood nearby. Brooks hovered over the scene. The Whitmore family watched from the private room. Phones were still raised. Eleanor's eyes moved from Noah to Terrence. She stopped. "Mr. Coleman?" Terrence looked up. Eleanor's voice changed. "Sir." The recognition spread through the room. The chief executive recognized him. The medical director recognized him. The board members recognized him. Vanessa covered her mouth. Helen's irritation disappeared. Brooks went completely still. Eleanor stepped forward. "This is Terrence Coleman," she said. She explained that Terrence's foundation funded the pediatric emergency program, that he served as vice chair of the hospital board, that he was the principal donor behind the pediatric emergency wing scheduled to open the next morning, and that he had personally helped write the patient care charter. The staff stared at him. Terrence didn't react. He didn't demand an apology. He didn't remind anyone of his position. He looked toward the medical director. "My son needs treatment." That was all. The medical director moved immediately. Noah was placed on a gurney and taken into a resuscitation room. A full team surrounded him. Equipment that had sat untouched suddenly came alive. Monitors were connected. Oxygen was adjusted. Medication was prepared. Doctors and nurses moved quickly. Terrence followed Noah and held his hand. He didn't look back. He didn't care who was being questioned in the hallway. His son came first. Always. Within the hour, Noah's breathing stabilized. The attending physician spoke quietly to Terrence. Another 10 or 15 minutes could have put him in a much more dangerous condition. Terrence sat beside the bed. Noah was asleep. His breathing was steady. Terrence watched his chest rise and fall. For the first time that night, he allowed himself to breathe normally too. He thought about how close they had come to a completely different ending. He stayed beside Noah until a nurse confirmed he was fully stable. Only then did Terrence walk back toward the reception area. Brooks was still there. Helen was there. Vanessa was there. The hospital leadership stood around them. Brooks tried to explain. "I was following the chart." Terrence looked at him. "You were following a piece of paper." Brooks said nothing. "You knew my son couldn't breathe." Terrence's voice remained controlled. "You didn't need to know who I was." He looked at Vanessa. "You didn't need to know what I owned." Then Helen. "You didn't need to know who I knew." Then Brooks. "You only needed to know that an 8-year-old boy was struggling for air." Nobody moved. Terrence continued. "The failure didn't begin when the board arrived. It began when the first question was about payment instead of the child's condition. It continued when an inaccurate note became more important than what everyone could see. It became dangerous when a familiar name received a room before a child in respiratory distress. And it became unacceptable when a doctor protected his authority instead of examining the patient." Terrence paused. "My father worked in hospitals for 26 years. He fixed beds, replaced lights, cleaned what other people ignored. Most people never knew his name. But he taught me something. The true measure of a hospital isn't how it treats people with money. It's how it treats people who walk through the door with nothing but hope." Terrence briefly mentioned Rachel. He explained that after her death, he had built his foundation not simply to keep himself busy, but to make sure other families had access to care when they were most vulnerable. I didn't fund this emergency wing so my own son could receive special treatment. I funded it so no child would need a powerful father to be saved. The room was silent. Terrence looked around. The frightening part isn't that you didn't recognize me. It's that you recognized what my family looked like and decided we could wait. He shook his head. This isn't about rich people and poor people. It's about the habit of ranking human beings by money, appearance, connections, and assumptions. And that habit can kill. He didn't demand revenge. He asked for the records to be preserved. Every intake note, every edited chart entry, security footage, Olivia's alert, internal calls, the order in which the patients arrived. Everything. He wanted facts before punishment. The investigation began immediately. Dr. Brooks was suspended. The investigation later confirmed that he had seen the emergency alert and still delayed examining Noah. His contract was terminated. The case was referred to the state medical board. Helen was removed from her position as charge nurse for prioritizing donor comfort, blocking a legitimate safety concern, and calling security instead of addressing the emergency. Vanessa wasn't fired immediately. She was suspended from intake duties, required to complete retraining, and placed under disciplinary review for the inaccurate note that had started the chain of events. The 2 security guards were required to complete new training on patient rights and their responsibility to question unsafe instructions. Terrence didn't punish everyone simply because he was angry. He wanted accountability. And he wanted change. Olivia was different. She had checked Noah's oxygen when nobody else would. She had brought him oxygen when a doctor refused to act. She had entered accurate information into the system, despite knowing she could be punished. Terrence found her near the nurse's station. "Thank you," he told her. Olivia looked overwhelmed. "I just did what I was supposed to do." Terrence shook his head. "That's exactly why I'm thanking you." He offered her a position on the hospital's new patient safety team. She would have real authority to help redesign the procedures that had failed Noah. A good system should never force someone with a conscience to choose between saving a patient and keeping their job. Olivia accepted. Within the same week, St. Gabriel's board approved sweeping reforms. Every patient showing visible warning signs would receive medical assessment before insurance or payment discussions could delay care. Nurses were given authority to trigger emergency reassessments without waiting for a doctor's permission. A confidential reporting system was created so staff could report safety concerns or bias without fear of retaliation. Donor status and personal connections were formally prohibited from influencing clinical priority. An independent patient advocate was assigned to help families who struggled to be heard. And the new patient care charter was no longer treated as a ceremonial document. It became a standard. 3 months later, Terrence brought Noah back to St. Gabriel for a routine follow-up. Noah walked through the lobby full of energy. In his hands was a small cardboard rocket he had built himself. It was for Olivia. As father and son crossed the lobby, the emergency doors opened. A man in a work uniform rushed inside carrying a little girl. She was struggling to breathe. 3 months earlier, the front desk might have asked for insurance. This time, nobody did. Olivia was already moving. She checked the girl's vital signs. The child was taken back for treatment in less than a minute. Nobody looked at the father's uniform. Nobody asked whether he knew someone on the board. Nobody asked whether he could pay. They simply saw a child who needed help. Noah watched. Then he looked up at his father. Dad? Yes? Is this how it's always supposed to work? Terrence looked toward the little girl being treated. Yes. He squeezed Noah's hand. This is how it's supposed to work. For everyone. Noah thought about that for a moment. Then he reached for his father's hand. Together, they walked through the lobby. At the entrance, the patient-first charter was mounted where everyone could see it. It was no longer a promise waiting for a ribbon-cutting ceremony. It was a standard. A child's life should never have to prove its worth through money, status, appearance, or connections. True care begins the moment we see another human being in need and decide that their need is enough. Noah's story became a reminder that dignity should never depend on what someone looks like when they walk through a hospital door. Sometimes change begins with one person refusing to look away. Sometimes it begins with a nurse willing to risk her career. Sometimes it begins with a father refusing to let his child believe he is worth less than anyone else. And sometimes, the most powerful lesson a hospital can learn is that every patient deserves to be treated as though they matter before anyone knows their name. If you believe every child deserves to be seen, heard, and treated with dignity before anyone checks their family's bank account, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share Noah's story with someone who still believes doing the right thing matters. Because stories like Noah's remind us that courage doesn't always look powerful. Sometimes courage looks like a father holding his son. Sometimes it looks like a nurse pressing an oxygen mask into a child's hands. And sometimes it means standing in a room full of people who have forgotten what compassion means and refusing to sit back down. Thank you for watching all the way to the end.